I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. Hey, and guys, I'm happy to say that today I've got my good friend Jay back in the studio with me again. We're going to do another episode. Again, hopefully one of just a number. Jay has got some fantastic material that I'd love to get out of his head. You want to say hello, Jay?
Thanks for having me back, Kevin.
Well, I appreciate it. So tonight's episode is going to be titled The One That Got Away. And the title is very fitting because we are going to talk about the one that got away. This was a huge case. Again, Jay's going to carry the majority of this, my involvement with this investigation. I was with it, the majority of it, but I was more of a peripheral player. And Jay was definitely right in the thick of things and involved with this thing. So the one that got away, and Jay, you want to just kind of start us off with how this thing began?
Sure. This particular case was like you said, Kevin, it was a big deal here in the Phoenix metropolitan area many years ago, and it involved a multiple serial armed robbers that were targeting restaurants and bowling alleys throughout the metro area. They would break in, they would hold up restaurants during closing, the closing protocol at night, and sometimes in the morning they would put a mask on, grab a gun, go in, tie people up, rob, make the manager open up the safe, grab driver's license out of pockets, threaten managers and employees' families.
So this definitely isn't like a convenience store, $40 out of the till at the counter, run in, run back out. I mean, this is some lengthy, long duration. Sounds like pretty hard monetary losses.
They were big losses, and they were not your typical crime of opportunities that just presented themselves to a criminal. I mean, these are events that take a lot of collaboration between the criminals, communicating what are we going to do, who's going to do what. It's like a choreographed dance that these criminals were doing in order to relieve a business of their proceeds. Yeah. They were doing it across multiple jurisdictions. So Tempe, you and I work for the city of Tempe. Tempe got hit a number of times, as did Phoenix and some some suburbs of Phoenix, particularly in the east side of the valley.
Okay.
So as the numbers increased, individually the cities were aware of their problems. So at the time I was working SAU, Special Investigations Bureau, which we had a group of 6 guys that were dedicated to go out and target property-related crimes. Unlike last time I was here, I believe we talked about some drug issues, or maybe another conversation. But they were involving property-related crimes, so we were to look at statistics that were fed to us by some data analysts, and we would go out and do surveillances of particular restaurants that fit the parameter of a target.
The MO.
The MO, right?
Yeah.
So that was our focus.
And I do know part of, and I think I've alluded to this in the past as well, but part of being a detective in SAU is you would coordinate and you would have, a relationship with detectives with various criminal aspects. So if you had a robbery detective, you would have that robbery detective work with you. And so that was kind of what led into this as well, correct? We had some collaboration and some contact with a robbery detective that was saying, hey, here's this going on as well.
Exactly. And at the time, they wouldn't have even known about the other cities' problems they were having. They would have been the detectives that worked for Tempe saying, we're showing a pattern of robberies on Baseline Road or South Tempe or a geographic area or a particular restaurant that gets hit multiple times, similar restaurant to a chain restaurant maybe, as opposed to a mom and pop store. So somebody had some familiarity with and we assumed, based on the way the robberies were occurring, that whoever was doing these robberies had some familiarity with both these types of businesses.
So, and the only way to be familiar, unless it's your own house or your own business, is you've got to go out and scout these places. Correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. So we have a pretty good indication that there's some pre-planning, there's some scouting going in. Again, this isn't, the drug addict that runs into a Circle K on a whim with a gun and steals $40 out of the till. These are pretty well planned and thought out. And again, huge monetary losses.
Well, they were, and they were conducted by multiple suspects. So we assume there were always 2 involved and sometimes 3.
Wow.
Somebody driving a getaway car and 2 people that were usually inside the restaurant to manage the employees, however many they had, closing up or opening in the morning.
So at that point in time, you've got, and I remember doing this, you'd have a trend, and our squads would essentially adjust schedules to accommodate, surveillance on wherever you thought the next hit would occur or whatever. And then as it goes, if they're hitting at closing, you're talking about 1, 2 in the morning-ish.
Yes.
And open would be, I don't know, who knows, depending on the business, sometimes let's just say from 8 to 10 in the morning. If it's a bar, maybe a little later. So it's still kind of you don't really have anything to give you a strong indication. So it's really a needle in a haystack.
It really was. These individuals always wore masks. They always wore gloves. They would use rope or zip ties to restrain the employees as they were trying to control their movements as they were doing their robberies. So we really had nothing to go on. Occasionally we'd get a description of a vehicle that might have been seen leaving the scene, but they never panned out. They never gave us much to go on.
So at what point did we transition, or what made things change from doing essentially just some shot in the dark spot surveillance on places to getting us something a little more defined?
We got real lucky. We had a city police officer actually respond, another city's police officer responded to a domestic violence call in his jurisdiction, and it was a man and a woman having a squabble, and they separated the 2, and at some point the woman vented to this patrolman that arrived to mitigate their domestic issues. And told this officer, hey, and all the robberies you've been having across the valley, it's my husband and his brother that have been doing it. And along with my brother-in-law's fiance, they've been doing all these robberies of restaurants and bowling alleys. And so at that point, this officer conveyed the information to Tempe, and Tempe detectives started comparing notes with other cities' property detectives, armed robbery, violent crime detectives, and they discovered that at the time the girlfriend had shared her information about her boyfriend or husband being involved in these robberies, there had been maybe 20 or 25 robberies had been committed in the valley, all big-ticket items where a lot of money. There was a pattern of increasing violence with each robbery.
So, a couple of takeaways there. One, if you're going to be a crook, don't piss off your girlfriend / wife / fiance / on the side, whatever. And 2, here's another great example of, sometimes the biggest of cases are solved with some of the most out-of-the-way, benign. How would you ever think that was going to be the way that it would open this case up for us?
We got lucky.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a lucky shot.
And we had a diligent officer on the other end that took the time to share that information.
Good point. Because oftentimes, you go to those calls and you'll have people, I always laugh because I think of that one. Remember the one where he got weed. The vehicle stopped and the woman, but you'll get that information, but a lot of times it's bogus, or you don't even feel that it, merits mentioning to anybody else. But this guy obviously thought, this is something big, and it turned out to be huge.
It did.
Yeah.
It did. And if I remember correctly, too, she wanted to pull those words back at some point.
She did.
Because by the end of their police contact, I think she was falling back in love with her man. But the cat was out of the bag by that time.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So then you guys get this information from this other jurisdiction. You start comparing notes. We're up into the mid-20s. So this is definitely a serial robbery case. Where does it go from there?
Based off the information that she provided and was shared among the law enforcement, we identified the major suspect in these robberies, and I'm going to call him Bob. So we identified Bob, his fiance, and his brother was identified by the girlfriend at the domestic squabble.
Right.
So we knew these 3 individuals almost immediately after getting that information from her. Agencies got together, the victim agencies got together that had crimes committed in their city, and they dedicated resources to following Bob.
So at this point, I'm just, I want to make sure as we progress through our levels of how we're going to deal with this problem. So our first run at this is a conventional run where we basically work surveillance. We identify the criminal and we try to put physical surveillance on them with cops in cars.
We did.
basically is it. So
That's it.
we try that, correct?
We did.
And what happens?
Well, right out of the chute, we discovered that Bob owned a restaurant himself in Phoenix. And it was unfortunately, it was a restaurant when surveilling officers followed Bob to his restaurant. This particular restaurant was frequented by just nothing but law enforcement.
Wow.
So we had a real problem because his business loved cops. Actually, inside his business, he had kind of a tribute wall to fallen officers, and we knew there was a really weird dynamic and a strange relationship that this man had, if he was in fact the right suspect, which we didn't know at this time, but there was a bit of a tug of war that was going on. And so it was real concerning to officers and detectives like us and working undercover that to follow Bob and his fiancée around. We had to be real diligent because we didn't want the information. Information is shared in the department, so you knew, patrolman knew, sometimes what you were working on, and we were concerned that would get back to him.
Right. I think this is probably one of the first cases that I was exposed to, because I came into this case in just a little bit more as Jay progresses, but good example of having to keep a case a secret, essentially, even from the rest of your department. So I know that even other cops that were in our department, we weren't allowed to discuss the case. They weren't allowed to know it. They weren't privy to anything that you were doing. And then the events that things would come up where you would need, let's just say, a random vehicle stop done. You couldn't even tell them why or what it was for. The only thing you could say is, look, we need this vehicle stop. We need to identify this person and or do whatever, but I can't tell you anything else. And then same thing when we started dealing with the restaurant issue with the police that frequented there. That was even worse because now we've got this whole jurisdiction where there's probably cops that are buddies of this guy. So we even more can't let the cat out of the bag with that other jurisdiction. So things had to be kept very secretive and close to the chest.
It was very complicated, and we had to hold these cards really tight. It was very common to have an officer roll into the restaurant to go to dinner or have lunch. He'd step outside with Bob and they'd point across the street, point out undercover cops that were sitting across the street watching him. And not done to be hurtful to the investigation. It was just like, dude, why are the cops watching your place? It was just...
Unwittingly.
Yeah, he was unwitting.
Right.
It was done with no malintent.
So obviously it sounds like our conventional surveillance went out the window pretty quick.
It did, although we tried for months, so I won't say relatively quick. I mean, for months, Phoenix would assign guys to follow him around at night, and he was very good at burning that surveillance. And I've been burned, you've been burned, and It's a very bad, bitter pill to swallow.
Nobody likes it.
Nobody likes it when you have a bad guy that you're following who sneaks up on a car parked a block away from where you last saw him and taps on your window and asks you, why are you following me? And this is the aggressive nature of Bob. Bob was an aggressive in your face. I know you're back there. I see you in my mirror. I see you following me.
Right. Waves
at you. On one occasion when Tempe was following him, he burned me, followed me into a gas station when I turned into a gas station and forced me to basically fill up my police undercover car with my credit card, maintain the ruse of being innocent of following him. But he burned me.
Right.
We both knew it.
And, sometimes they start to follow you. They'll flip the table. They'll just start to follow you to make you know that they know. And again, these are people that, we have a ton of experience. We've been following people around a long time. It's not like you're just throwing someone in a white Crown Vic. Crown Vic, it shows how old I am, but a white car that screams police car and say, hey, go follow this person. I mean, these are people that, and I've alluded to this in other episodes, these are groups of 5, 6, 7, 8 guys sometimes where we know how to conduct surveillance and we do it really well. And, when you take a burn, you swap out cars, you swap out a lot of things. And this guy was honestly probably the best guy at burn surveillance that I can recall.
He was the best I ever met.
There you go.
And we've forgot to include the aerial surveillance on occasion that we had on him. We'd have a fixed wing flying surveillance so the officers driving vehicles could stay back further. We would have a helicopter on occasion, would be assisting, when we thought he was, honing in on a particular target so we could back away, including some electronic surveillances that were being developed in those days.
Yeah, yep.
So,
and part of that also, it should start to give you a good taste of just how important this case was, because it's not every case. It's actually Rare is the case where we start to pull in assets and resources such as air support. Air support's really expensive and it's highly in demand. So you have to have a really good case to actually get those assets assigned. So it just starts to give you that indication of this is a big case. It was a big deal. It was very important. It was multi-jurisdictional. Again, they were into the 20s, if not the high 20s for robbery incidents. So it was a big deal.
It was. These guys were worthy of all the resources that were poured in them.
So we try conventional. It runs its course. And I do recall it did run some months. It wasn't like we tried it a week and gave up. It did run its course, and it was just, we came to the conclusion that this is just never going to work.
We came to that conclusion at one particular morning after we had 2 really good days of surveillance where we followed Bob and his fiancee from their home in Scottsdale. They drove into Phoenix, and they took a hotel room close to some restaurant clusters that were along one of our major freeways running through town. And surveillance team, it was actually Tempe's surveillance team that was on them at that time, watched them check into a hotel room, and hours later, they came out of the hotel room, parked up the street in their vehicle that we had identified, and watched the closing practice of this particular restaurant. There was no business for them being there, and the restaurant was named Fajitas. And so we were pretty sure that they were going to hit Fajitas that night or soon if they didn't do it that night. And they didn't do it that night or the next morning. So my particular squad got on them the following evening, and we went, the majority of our surveillance guys went to the restaurant, and we circled the restaurant. I actually was in the parking lot of the restaurant in the backseat of my car in the middle of summer, just dug in, waiting from like 7 o'clock in the evening till we knew they closed at 9 or 10. And hopefully that their surveillance people that were on their house would give me a heads up that they were heading over.
Pick them up.
And they eventually went to the restaurant.
So what happened from there?
Well, they went to the restaurant, parked north of the restaurant a couple hundred yards, and we were awful excited. We knew we had this guy finally. And Bob got out of the car. His fiancee took a seat in the driver's seat, so we assumed she was going to be the getaway driver. And Bob walked down the street, walked into the parking lot to one side of the restaurant and hid behind the dumpster. And from where I was at, I had a very good view of the back door of this restaurant that led to the dumpster. So at that point, I was calling the surveillance, giving everybody the word. He's still there.
And no other reason for him to be there.
No reason. He was dressed completely in black, had gloves on, had a hat on, and it was hot. It was miserable. So he was suited up for him to go to work that day.
Yeah.
So he stayed in the restaurant till I questioned whether or not, when I blinked, he might have got, he didn't stay in the restaurant, he stayed behind the dumpster.
Hiding spot.
Until I was starting to question whether or not he was still back there, because it had been hours, and the restaurant closed up, everybody left the parking lot, there were a few vehicles left in the parking lot, usually from those that had too much to drink. I left there, my car included, so I didn't stand out, and we watched Bob get out of his car, or get out from behind the dumpster, walk back to his vehicle, got in the passenger seat, and they drove home.
So what are you thinking at that point?
Well, I was pissed.
Yeah, I bet you were.
We were frustrated. We were angry. We were so close, yet it didn't happen. Everybody was questioning if they had done something wrong, including me,
Right.
Had I done something wrong? But there was no accounting for it. So we rallied up.
Well, I was just going to say, and you just never know. You never know what it was that keeps someone from doing something or causes them to do it. It could have been something as benign as just seeing a person somewhere that wasn't even related to the cops, because we talk about taking a burn, and we all know that there's a lot of times we think we've been burned on a surveillance, but later on you find out that they didn't have a clue as to who you were or
Right.
what you're doing. And then the other thing I do want to touch on is, remember, Phoenix in the summer is just miserable. Even in the nighttime, it still stays up in the 100 degrees. So you got all these guys, you can't run your car, you can't run that AC, it's closed up. So it's like being inside a Ziploc bag. A lot of times you got your uniform on, your blacks, your bullet resistant vest, all that crap. So you're just sweating like a pig. And this goes for hours. So to add emphasis to Jay's point about being pissed, you've gone through all of that. And the only consolation to being in all that crap and sweating yourself to death is knowing that pretty soon you're probably going to get to jump out and go arrest a bad guy.
Exactly.
You're going to handle business. You're going to stop a crime trend. You're going to save somebody's life. You're going to do something. But when those things come to fruition like that, yeah, there's no other way to put it than, like you said, you're pissed. You're pissed.
Yeah, there were a lot of pissed off officers that night.
I remember.
So we all rallied up and a decision was made. There was some discussion about staying later since he had done 2 or 3 early morning robberies.
When the restaurant would open.
When the restaurant opened. So we had the location identified and we discussed it, and there was a decision made that statistically and economically it didn't make sense to keep us there till the morning shift came, and so we everybody went home. Until I went home, went to bed, tried to sleep, couldn't sleep, got a call next morning about 8 in the morning telling me that Bob had gone back to fajitas in the morning and done a robbery of that particular restaurant.
And, of course, there's no surveillance on him at that point.
None.
Right? Yeah. So, nice. But, again, that's how it goes sometimes.
So that was a turning point in the investigation. We shared our frustration and our lack of success with the other agencies that were involved. A real dedicated task force came together, not just surveillance driven. We really felt we'd exhausted every traditional means of catching this criminal in the commission of this crime. And we had failed. We couldn't do it. So you're left with a couple of options. You either, take your toys and go home and ignore him and let him continue doing his crimes, or you take another step and move forward and start looking at the options of doing a wiretap on this individual, because criminals have to communicate with one another. They conspire with one another to commit their crimes. And we knew there were 3 people involved in this particular series of crimes, so that was what we moved on to.
So, you hit on a really important issue with the exhaustion term. So just so people not in law enforcement understand, you do these large investigations, and Jay hit it exactly on the head. You start out with what you believe will minimally take care of the crime trend. So, surveillance may be what minimally has to be put into place to deal with that. Well, that doesn't work. So we've technically exhausted, so to speak, that option, that tactic. So then we move up to, like he's saying, then you have to start to look at a wiretap, because, again, people have to communicate with each other. And one of the key points of obtaining a wiretap, and again, wiretaps are not something that's done every day. I mean, that's a rare thing to do with criminal investigation, to get a wiretap, because they are hard to get, as they should be. I mean, it's a huge infringement on someone's rights. You are basically dipping your ear into their personal, private conversations on a phone. So one of the major issues with obtaining a wiretap is you have to show that you've exhausted all other investigative means, and you really have no other options in how to deal with this crime trend, whether it be, a robbery trend or drugs or whatever the case. So exhaustion is a really important term, and to understand it.
This was an easy case to show that we had exhausted every traditional and known means, and even some that we didn't know about before we started this case, to try to remedy this criminal behavior and stop this guy. He was going to kill somebody at some point, whether by design or by accident, shooting through a door when a manager locked himself in the door with a safe combination.
And if I remember right, you said that they had kind of started to escalate their aggression as well, correct? Because in the beginning, there was a display of a firearm, correct?
Yes.
But then as there was a little bit of resistance that happened, and 1 or 2 of them, he'd crank a round off through the office door, right? So you're showing a propensity to increase. The aggression is there. And really, it's just a matter of time before some poor sap happens to be standing behind that door that he cranks around through, and he kills him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at that point, we tagged a couple of detectives, myself and a Phoenix detective, to work with our county attorney and craft an affidavit in support of a wiretap. So the idea was to wiretap Bob's home phone and his work telephone and the brother's phone to see if we could capture communication between the 2 of them or the 3 of them when they were discussing the plans to conduct their next robbery or discussing past robberies that they may have committed that only the robbers, only the criminals would have known about. So we kind of backed off the traditional surveillance because honestly we wanted to hit the ground running and make sure that he felt very comfortable that there was no surveillance on him when we went up on the wire. So we backed off, I think, for about a month or maybe even 6 weeks. And during the time we backed off, another robbery was committed, which we believed was the same group of people committing them. So we moved forward as fast as we could and as prudent as we could, writing a proper affidavit in support of the wire.
So Jay, you and I have both written a number of search warrants. I have not ever written a wiretap. So how would you compare workload to writing a search warrant to writing the affidavit for a wiretap?
Well, I mean, the average affidavit for a generic search warrant, I mean, you might accomplish your goal in 2 or 3 pages of narrative telling the story to the court. I want to go into Kevin's house because of this, or Jay's house.
Right.
When you're telling a bigger story that involves a wiretap interception of communication, it's much greater. The degree of inclusion of all the information is so much greater. So I think this particular affidavit, by the time I was done telling the story, we had about 100-page story. So you're writing like a little mini novel to the court explaining who these people are, what they're doing, your suspicions, everything. You're explaining everything you've tried and failed in. I want to listen to them because of everything I just told you in the last 90 pages, and here are the phones I want to listen to.
Right. Which, again, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that, again, this is not something that's done every day, and it's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and it's a real hot topic in the media, it seems like right now, on the federal level, discussing these FISA warrants. And I know any warrant or any affidavit, and I've written 6 wiretap affidavits myself and participated in 3 others. So 9 wiretaps, and I believe you've got 10 or 11 under your belt.
Yeah.
There are so many levels of review and so many attorneys reading your work and judges, reviewing it. It's an amazing review process. So by the time you get to turning a wiretap on or doing a wiretap, you're real comfortable that you're doing the right thing. And we were doing the right thing in this one.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, yeah. Clearly. So we get the wire written up.
Got the wire all written, and we were working with the phone companies to develop the circuits at the time. They had some technology issues, so they had to do their thing, only to discover that Bob and his brother turned their telephones off. So the telephones were turned off. The restaurant phone was still on, but the 2 brothers had turned their phones off. So,
and don't you always question if that was in somehow they got tipped off? The timing's just...
I will always question that. Who turns their phones off, for no reason? So their landlines, off.
Right.
And cell phones were terribly expensive back in the day, so they weren't cell phone users. So we modified, the discussion was made to do a hardwire. And a hardwire is when you actually have to enter a premise and install a transmitting device inside a office or room, a house, wherever you believe that the illegal activity is going to be discussed. It would be like putting a bug in your studio, that we were unaware. You and I are unaware right now as we talk about this, to listen to what it is we're talking about if we are talking about committing crimes. So
almost getting into the CSI realm here.
It was crazy. For me at the time, I had participated in one with a federal agent as a surveillance officer when somebody flew out from out of state and installed a bug in a place in our city, just providing them cover for it while he was inside installing the transmitter. It's real rare. It's a very rare process.
So, and Jay and I discussed this prior to the recording, but we understand, this is a huge invasion of privacy. I mean, a wiretap is an invasion of privacy, but you start talking about law enforcement being given legal permission to enter your home and put listening devices in it. It's a pretty big deal.
It's huge. I can't think of a bigger deal. And the only reason we were granted authority to do that is we had plenty of evidence to support the fact that we were installing these transmitting devices in the right person's home. They were responsible for these armed robberies, and the violence was getting increasingly worse.
Right. And again, we come back to the exhaustion issue. You guys had exhausted every possible way to solve this thing legally, because again, the cops, we have to follow the rules. This isn't like in the 50s where you could basically pull Bob aside in some dark alley and, start smacking him around until he admitted to doing these robberies. You can't do that stuff anymore.
No.
So, and then I also want to kind of help put it in perspective. I believe, and Jay alluded to this already with this hardwire of a structure. Jay's only been involved in this twice, correct? In your whole career? The one you just said with the guy coming from back east and the one that you actually were part of?
I did one other after this case. On another wire.
Oh, look at you. Okay, so 3.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just say 3 then. So, and I've only been involved in one, being this one that you did. Now, put that in context with, between Jay and I, we've probably got at least 20 wiretap cases under our belt that we were involved with. The average cop never even touches one wiretap case. So, you see the exclusivity with how many wiretaps that we've been involved in comparative to the average cop, and then take it to the next level of this essentially hardwire of a structure. And I've only done one, and that's the one that Jay's going to tell you about. So it's not something that's taken lightly. It's not something that law enforcement just does willy-nilly all over the place. It's not like CSI and Mission Impossible and all this crap where these guys are, putting these bugs in at the drop of a hat and at someone's whim. And the other problem is, and Jay will touch on this, technology is fickle and it's a pain in the butt. And if it can break, it's going to break. And so, none of this stuff is as sure as it all looks like on TV. I wish it was, right? That would be much cooler that way.
Should be a lot easier.
The installs, the way they work, all this other stuff, it's super cool. But it'd creep me out. If it was my house and I thought someone put listening devices in my house, it would creep me out. However, I'm not a serial robber. I'm not a crook. I'm not a criminal. I'm not someone who's on the verge of getting someone killed by cranking rounds through the door. So you know what? This is kind of one of those, if you're going to play the game, then you're going to play the game and things are going to happen. So anyway, so that was my tangent just to make sure people understand what a rarity this really is.
Let me add something to that. It creeps you out going into somebody else's house.
Oh, I can imagine.
Even if you have a piece of paper with you that tells you
you're legally there.
You're legally there. Here is a court order for you to go into this house do what you're there for.
Right.
It doesn't make you feel less scared, and it's a bit of a creepy feeling.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah. So you get that all done, and where's it go from there?
There were 2 guys dedicated to do the entry. They were with the county attorney's office, and so they started practicing picking locks and working on the technology that they were going to install when they went in there. And then I pointed out the fact that Bob had a very large dog in the house, so I was invited to be part of the entry team since I had some canine experience, and I would help wrangle a dog if needed and let them do their job. So a day was picked on the calendar, orders were signed, big briefings were held with so many people. We had already identified a listening post just about 100 yards away from their house, so I had gone in and rented a condominium close to their house, and wire room was set up in this condo where, it was just a wire room, which is a pretty interesting component. We turned the bedroom into this house, into the wire room. And then the day came where surveillance was dedicated to follow them away from their house and back to the restaurant. And while they were out of the house, our job was to go into the house and install the transmitters.
Interesting. One of the things that always made me a little hinky about doing that kind of stuff, any issues with neighbors at either place, whether Bob's place or with the wire room?
The wire room, fortunately, was in an adjoining complex, so there was no shared neighbors. It was on the other side of a fence. Like, we had 2 large condominium developments that butted up against one another, so we didn't have the problem there. Other than, it's curious. We had people that were concerned and curious about us, but we didn't tell anybody while we were there.
Right.
We just would sneak in as best we can and do our business. And Bob's particular house, it was very problematic. There were shared walls with other neighbors. It was a challenging, difficult place. So once they left the house and surveillance had confirmed they were at the restaurant, which was 20 miles away from where we were at, when conditions were right, it looked like enough of the neighbors had vacated. 3 of us swooped in and got our bag of goodies and went to the front door, only to discover that all the locks had been changed and a security door had been put on the front door, which, again...
Strange timing.
Very strange timing.
What a coincidence.
Very strange timing. So at that point, there was a lot of oh crap looks given to one another, and hands got a bit shaky with our locksmith, who was, an investigator, who was a great lockpicker. But when you're terrified and you're not working on the same locks you've been practicing on, it's not TV stuff.
Sure. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. And, another thing I want to point out is, as has happened, this case or a whole bunch of cases when you're doing wiretaps or you're doing surveillance or whatever else, if you're confronted, even if you're confronted by other people in law enforcement, in certain cases by law, you're not even allowed to divulge what you're doing.
Exactly.
So when you rise to the level of especially a wiretap investigation, other law enforcement or other people, you're not allowed to divulge, you're not allowed to discuss any detail whatsoever. They can actually charge you criminally.
It's just a real awkward space to be operating in.
I will say some of the coolest stuff you ever do is doing those investigations, but also some of the most stressful. I always felt it was like, especially with this Bob case, keeping things from people that I worked with on a daily basis was tough.
It is.
Difficult.
We all like to share our stories.
Absolutely.
I mean, even sharing this story with you and your listeners right now, my heart's beating faster than normal because I'm taken back to the front door years ago. Yeah. And I feel like I'm right back there.
And even still, there's little bits and pieces here that Jay's going to have to still hold back, too, to be quite honest, even after the passage of so much time. Anyway, okay, so up to the door, poor lock, again, doing lockpick stuff, I totally get that. Because you train on doing one for a certain entry, and when you get thrown for a loop, now you're like, oh shit, everything's on me to get in this door.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. No, it was a big curveball we were throwing there. And there was a big pissed off dog on the other side of this door, letting everybody know that they knew somebody was fiddling with their door.
Right.
So I saw we were never going to get in through the door. Our guy was never going to open the door for us. So I just made a decision to break into the house a traditional way. I figured if there was a big dog in there, they probably had a big doggy door. So I just hopped a fence to a little patio, private patio to the house, found a big doggy door in there, not big enough for me to go in and out of, but big enough for me to reach my arm through and remove the dowel that was prohibiting the sliding glass Arcadia door to operate. And so I broke into the house like maybe a burglar would, and not by using the front door. And the dog wasn't very happy to see me. By this time, he knew somebody was coming into his house, but I convinced him to go hide in the bathroom. So he went down the hall into the bathroom. I locked him in there, and then I let the other two guys as part of the team in through a window.
Interesting.
Everybody got to work. So my job, I photographed, a lot of photographing to make sure everything was put back into its place. If a chair had to be moved to put a transmitter behind a wall or in an outlet, I would do that. Had a bunch of silly photographs with me, just Polaroids. It was just the simplest thing to do, and photographed everything and let these guys do their work. And 3 transmitters were installed, and I let them out the window. Let the dog out the door. He backed me out of the house, and I went out his doggy door the way I came in.
How long were you guys in there?
It seemed like days, but, several hours.
Yeah.
It just seemed like it went on forever. And we were only successful in getting one of the microphones to work. 2 of the 3 microphones didn't transmit properly. So,
well, again, there you go. So we're talking about technology and, reality versus movie.
So we had to go back in several more times to get them working. So it was just repeat the process from the day before, and each time became increasingly more scary.
Oh, I'm sure it was just nerve-wracking.
It was terrible.
I'm sure it was terrible.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Well, I remember, because again, I was working a surveillance component for this at the time, and so we would, and Jay was on a different squad than me, so we would hear the updates and reports, and then we'd hear, they had to go in again. You're just going, holy shit, man. What's the deal? Is it ever going to get done? And the bigger fear, quite frankly, is you're going to get caught. Something's going to happen to get you caught.
That was always a fear. By the 3rd time that I went in, they were leaving the TV on for the dog. The dog, for some reason, had been peeing. He wouldn't go outside, so I think he was scared.
Gee, I wonder.
And I always pictured this dog trying to tell the story when they got home from work, about what he was experiencing during the day when he was at work. So it just became more unsettling every time he went in. And then at one point, I think we even had to bring somebody from the phone company in a different window with us because the voltage wasn't quite right. And we had some real technical issues. So. Yeah. And not only that, Kevin, what I've I've left out is when we got in, the whole purpose of doing what we were doing was to capture communication between Bob and his fiance, who we assumed drove the getaway car the day
Definitely involved.
Definitely involved. They weren't communicating with one another. It was apparent somebody was sleeping on the couch. There was looked like a permanent bed made up on one of the couches in the front room, and then somebody was in the bedroom. So it looked like they were having a bit of a spat.
So again, just another, whether it's a coincidence or not, just another thing that played against the investigation. You know, what are the chances that they decide to have this spat going on where they cease communication when we do what we did?
Exactly.
Yeah, just crazy coincidence. Okay, so you got it in. It's basically working one. And where do we go from there?
Well, we went back in and got the second one working, and then went back in and got the third one working. Then it was just a waiting game. You know, we were hoping that they would patch their relationship up with one another. And at this point, we wanted them to commit a robbery. You know, we were hoping that they would gear up to do another one. And we had really hoped that one of the brothers would come to the house and they would talk. We weren't getting any information off the business phone. That was easy. That was functioning. And it was procedurally, it was awkward too, because when you do a traditional wiretap, you don't listen to whole conversations. You know, your phone rings, you listen, hi, Jay, it's Kevin. You know, I want to talk to you about going to lunch. We don't listen to that kind of communication.
And what do you call that?
That's minimizing. You turn off your recording devices. Or, hi, Kevin, this is your attorney talking to you. You know, there are privileged conversations or conversations that don't fall into the scope of what you're investigating that you aren't authorized to listen to.
Right. And we do that obviously because, again, unlike TV and movies and everything, there are limitations as to what you can do as law enforcement. And there's certain things that on a wiretap you listen to and you don't. Now, when you start to talk about minimization, it's not like you know it instantaneously. So I can recall a number of times if you're one of the monitors and you're listening, well, you got to listen for a little while until you see, well, what is it they're talking about? Because the other problem is a lot of times these guys speak in code. So if they start talking about, you know, for like a dope case, for instance, I remember that one of the dope things was, you know, I need 50 apples. Well, 50 apples may sound like it was a conversation we don't need to be involved with, but we knew that apples was a code term for whatever drug it was that we were investigating at the time. I don't recall. So you don't know what it is until you listen for a little bit, but then you start to listen. And things that would be instantaneous though, like you're saying, attorney-client, spouse. You get two spouses starting to talk together, you back out of it right away.
Exactly. You have them talking to their doctor, talking to their priest.
That's another,
and normally these targets that we're wiretapping aren't talking to their doctor or their priest.
Not so much priest.
Sometimes they're attorneys, and sometimes... And you can kind of jump back into the call. You know, if it's a long call, you know, you've turned off, you've stopped listening to this call. And we really mean stop listening. It's not that we've stopped recording and we're still listening.
Yeah.
We stopped listening, but if this call is going on forever, you can jump back into the call. Okay, they're still talking about the baseball game. And you know that isn't their code talk. That's baseball talk.
Right.
You know, you get out of it.
Not relevant to the investigation.
Yeah. But when you install a microphone that's transmitter that's an open mic all the time, you're listening all the time. And in that case, you know, we had real strict guidelines from the court saying, okay, you're listening all the time, but these are the only ones you can record. And this was a real dead wire. It was very unproductive. It was very frustrating, very sad. We were happy at some point. We heard them engage in a fight with one another. Bob and his girlfriend were arguing. They had a pretty big argument one night that almost got to a point where our monitors were going to call the police department because they were concerned for her safety. And then they stopped fighting. And at that particular time, they patched up their relationship. And then Bob moved back into the bedroom. And so we had hopes that there would be some verbal communication after that particular night.
I'll bet you hear some pretty interesting things on that particular night. Moving on. So I'll jump in. And in conjunction with what Jay just described and where we had come, you know, at this point, we're all geared up and we are hoping that they're going to commit a robbery because now we've set everything up and in motion to capture this or to capture them doing it. And part of that was a surveillance component. So for the surveillance component, and this is my involvement, I was working that overnight shift and we had about 5 guys. And we worked from, I don't recall now, 7 p.m. to 7 in the morning possibly so that we could cover whether they did a close hit, which would have been, you know, midnight, 1 o'clock, whatever that would be. And or if it looked like he was going to do a open hit, we would essentially hold over and stick with it then. Well, as boring as it sounds like some of the monitor of the house was, that's what surveillance was on that night shift. There was nothing going on. I can tell you that we would meet in a parking lot and you would basically take turns napping in your car while someone else watched. I can remember bringing in a bucket full of change and rolling change for a couple of weeks during the shift, just different things that you did. And, the real drag of this was before like a legit smartphone. So you didn't have that smartphone to play games on and text and do all that other cool stuff that surveillance guys are able to do now.
I always feel real bad for my wire room guys and you guys, on surveillance. The case agents or the affiant in these wires, they're busy all the time because it doesn't matter if it's a dead wire or a non-productive wire, there are always things that I have to do. I have to report to the court, every few days. I have to have a visit with the judge. I have to show him, certain progress or lack of progress. And if we have lack of progress, I have to convince him why we need to extend for another 30 days because statistically, this guy has never gone more than 40.5 days without doing a robbery. There are a lot of things, but part of my duty when I see the interest starting to wane in surveillance team is try to stay connected to you guys. And so, I will bring pizzas in for the wiretap guys or work in the wire room. I will go visit, you guys at 3 and 4 in the morning to try to say, thank you. I know you're doing the best you can. I wish I could speed this up. So to me, I felt that was my job to keep you guys engaged as well, because I've been in that car when you have nothing but a talk show that you don't want to listen to. That's the only thing is engaging you, and it's miserable, and you wish you were home. And this particular wire occurred around Thanksgiving and Christmas, so I was extremely hated by many members of our cop, support crew because
I wouldn't say
Thanksgiving
that.
and Christmas were getting real screwed up for a lot of families because of this particular case.
But that's what happens. That's why people talk about the life of a cop is missing a whole lot of family functions and holidays and shift work and everything else. So, and I recall, I remember Jay was always really good about that stuff, very supportive of the people that help you, as you should be. You can't do a big investigation like that unless you have a lot of people around to support you.
And not one agency can usually kick in enough bodies to do this. So we would have bodies from DPS on the state level and just all the agencies that would kick in,
right.
If they had a body or two. Phoenix and Tempe carried most of the workforce on this, so, but still, it's a big commitment. And I stopped buying lunch for DPS because one time I bought them burritos and everybody got food poisoning. Oh. So that was a bad night. So they wouldn't take any more food from me after that.
Oh, God, I don't remember that one. That's funny.
Well, luckily you weren't there that night.
No, I wasn't. I will say the involvement that I have, and it's kind of a funny story, but again, we talk about technology and things that we were doing. Well, at that point in time, we were also tracking a vehicle. In those days, vehicle trackers were not the greatest, and they weren't the best on battery issues and everything else. So bottom line was the batteries for the vehicle tracker had to be changed almost on a nightly basis. And what that would entail me or another guy, usually two guys, to creep up there, slide underneath that car, pull it, change out batteries in the pitch black, and put it back where it was supposed to be, and then get out of there without being seen or heard or whatever else. So typically this would always fall to our shift because we were there overnight, and we do it at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, depending on the busyness of the neighborhood. Well, I always remember, again, this comes back to you're just bored out of your mind. You're so bored. So one night, Greg, who Jay and I know very well, and he's done a couple episodes as well, Greg and I get it in our mind that we're going to mess with the guy that is monitoring the tracker of the car, who's another good friend of ours, and that's Blair. And Blair's been mentioned in a couple episodes as well. Well, poor Blair was sitting in a parking lot with this monitor, and what it does is it basically makes a whole bunch of noise and racket and lights when the vehicle moves. So Greg and I go in to change out that battery pack, and I basically pull it, and I walk it over to Greg in his car, and Greg drives off. And so all of a sudden, the next thing you know is Blair's on the radio. I got movement. We got movement. And he's just going crazy and talking about it. And we had told everybody else what was going on because we didn't want everybody to go nuts over this thing. So we led Blair around for a little while. We finally led him back into this parking lot, and poor Blair pulls in, and he's so confused. And then he finally she sees Greg and I standing there, and if you know Blair doesn't get pissed. Blair was pissed that night because he really thought, this is it, man. This is the big one. Something's going to happen, and I'll never forget that. So, of course, we had to apologize to Blair. We didn't know he was going to take it quite so hard. That was our excitement for the night. Then, of course, we had to go get everything put back together, but it ended up working out. But, yeah, a lot of long, boring nights working a surveillance on something like that.
That was a bad one.
That was a bad one. So all these things are in motion. Surveillance is in motion. Very manpower intensive. We're spending a lot of money on an investigation like this.
We spent a lot of money on this one.
A lot of money. Not only the bodies that are involved, but the overtime issues. Guys like Jay who are doing everything as an affiant that involved you're almost working, I don't know. You're not ever not working.
Right.
You're available by phone, getting phone calls in the middle of the night all the time. So you're always working all the time. So it's pretty intensive.
It's pretty labor intensive.
Where are we at from here? We've got all this stuff going on. What now?
We were looking at failure. We were looking at approaching Christmas, and we knew that they were having financial problems based on the fewer people at their restaurant, and they just weren't doing well. So we just knew we were close. We were really, really close to being able to, we figured that they would go out and commit a robbery. And as Christmas approached and passed and we were looking at New Year's, it became apparent that we got beat.
Now, why?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think he knew too much about him being the target of the investigation. I do believe, in hindsight, looking back, based on a couple of indicators that I've had time to process over the years, that I think a neighbor may have told him that people were at his house that shouldn't have been, and with him maybe describing what his neighbors were seeing to cops that were friendly with him. And with them knowing procedures, I think unwittingly they might have shared with him that, well, maybe you're a target of the investigation or somebody close to you. So I think we got burned.
Do you ever look back, then or since, and think that maybe, did anybody ever intentionally give this investigation up to him? Do you ever have any thoughts of that?
I've had those thoughts. He had many pictures displayed in his house of him with firemen and policemen. And so he had a real tight relationship with law enforcement and our brothers in the fire department. And cops and firemen talked to one another frequently and ran into each other. And it could have been something that I did too when I was in the house. Maybe I didn't put something back properly. And I know I always let the dog out of the bathroom because by the time we got all our equipment out of there, I had been in and out of the residence six times total. And so just the frequency of entering and leaving and trying to set things up the way we left them, it's quite possible, maybe I didn't get something right too. So it's a combination. I don't know. If he would sit down and tell me the reason, I would like to have that conversation one day.
Wouldn't we?
Yeah.
So as things are closing down and essentially nothing is happening, you ever have any thoughts of wanting to do the old 50s, pull a guy in the alley? And
there were a lot of guys that wanted to see something bad happen to this man.
Yeah. It
was very emotional. At some point when I came into the wire room, there was a mantra going. And let me back up. We had a psychological evaluation done of this character, and it was the doctor's and the psychologist's opinion was, since he had so many close relationships with cops, that if we catch him coming out of a restaurant and he's engaged with being arrested, taken down, the opinion of these doctors was that he wouldn't go quietly. There would be a gun battle and he would be a suicide by cop situation because his psyche wouldn't he couldn't live with people knowing that that's who he was.
Sure.
So when I came in one day, there was a mantra like dead by Christmas, because we'd gone by Thanksgiving, it was approaching Christmas. And there was so many people that disliked this man as much as they did that I had to put the brakes on anybody saying that comment because I didn't want him to come out and actually engage somebody and somebody shoot somebody.
Right.
And then that come up. It was all innocent and done in jest and boredom, but I never wanted the justifiable shooting to be clouded by a silly statement being chanted in frustration.
Of course. Boy, I forgot about that. That would have been a good title too.
It would have been.
Dead by
Yeah,
Christmas.
that was the title of my book.
That's right. That would have been a good title. So anyway, so of course, yes, nothing that we're ever aware of. There's nothing inappropriate about that investigation. You know, as much as we would have loved to, we never did anything illegal. We never went beyond the fine line of doing what we were allowed to do.
Never did. And in this world of talk about officers planting evidence and doing illegal things to, the ends justify the means.
Right,
He's a
right.
bad guy, so he deserves it.
Right.
Nobody in that circle of investigation ever did anything inappropriate.
And if anybody deserved it, it would have been him. I mean, seriously.
I agree.
Right?
100%.
Yeah.
And he, not so much the planting of evidence, but I was just sure someday somebody was going to physically hurt him.
Right.
Because,
but I mean, if you went through the course of your career and someone pressed you and said, if there was one guy that you really would have, if you had to do one of those things that you would have done it to, he would have been the guy.
He was very deserving.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess tell me how it ends.
Well, it ended with a whimper. It just silently went away. We had no reason to ask for another 30-day extension of the wire. We had tried and we had failed. And so we went in. We had a major surveillance the day that we removed all the equipment to make sure everybody was accounted for and not near the house. So they were gone and pulled out her equipment and tucked everything away, and I wrapped up everything I needed to do as the case agent with the courts. We went back to business as usual for 10 days, and then my phone rang at 4 in the morning from a friend from Phoenix PD that told me that a restaurant right across the street from Fajitas on the other side of the freeway got robbed by two people, and the MO was identical to the one that our robbers that we had been chasing.
Right.
And but unlike the others, they'd left a little bit of evidence there. The robber had pulled up his ski mask and had spit inside the restaurant, so I begged, Phoenix PD or whoever was still out there to go swab the spit for some DNA, and they refused to do it. So their investigation went nowhere, and our bad guy got away with number 29.
Wow. So, yeah, because obviously you can't do these things forever. I mean, there's other work that's stacked up. From the supervisor perspective, you're getting calls from your own department and your own detectives saying, listen, we need help with this investigation and that investigation. So, there has to be an end point.
One thing I neglected, at the end of this wire, we did something to tickle the wire or try to get them to speak to one another. So we did something where we pulled one of the targets over, and I served a subpoena on one of the targets, and hopefully that they would speak with one another about a particular investigation panel that I was requesting their attendance at. And we figured that would stimulate some conversation. And it did. It triggered, don't talk to me about this inside the house. Let's go outside for a walk and discuss it. So that confirmed, that they were onto us, and they knew it. So we just went back to business as usual, and I would spot check the residents every now and then, as well as the business. And the business closed within a month or two after we shut down our investigation, and our main target vacated his property in Scottsdale and moved to the East Coast.
Do you think that, if for nothing, I mean, again, lackluster ending, but do you think that all the pressure and the potential for the cops to catch him got to him to where he stopped the trend?
Well, he stopped it here. I'm sure all we did was displace his criminal activity to another jurisdiction. So I'm no doubt in my mind that he knew by this time that we were onto him. We knew what he did. We knew what he had done. We knew he had done the recent robbery after we'd shut down the wire, and he had left. So there's no doubt in my mind that he knew he was a major focal point of law enforcement interest here. So he left. And he did the right thing. He left the valley for a period of time, but sometime later I heard he had returned back to the valley and no longer owned a restaurant, but was working at another restaurant. And so there was some effort. I think he might have even had some involvement in round two, or maybe looking into him again just to try to chart or track his activities.
We did.
But to my knowledge, we never saw the uptick again of a trend of robberies of restaurants and bowling alleys.
Nothing that I recall to the extent of this first go around that you were so involved in. You still just have to look at this case though and consider most criminals are dumb. The vast majority of them eventually get caught and with so many coincidences, and you got to think that someone was tipping him off. You just have to.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was smart, or smarter than
Definitely smarter than the average duck.
And I think he was so entrenched with law enforcement in his professional setting that I really believe that somebody tipped him off to it. Now, whether or not they tipped him off to the extent that of work that we were doing, or just said, they're looking at you,
right.
I'll never know.
Right. Yeah, we will never know. So, yeah, lackluster. Because I recall it. It's just a letdown. It was a letdown that you didn't get to do your job. It was a letdown that you didn't get to, have a culmination of something really awesome to all that time and effort that we put into it. Because, we feel the same, we want to do a good job for you guys that are the main investigators as well. You want to perform. You want to catch this guy. We want to be able to call you at 2 a.m. and say, we got him.
Exactly.
We got him. And it just none of that.
Yeah, it was very unsatisfying. And us as case agents and affiants in a big, case agent overview of the case, we feel a letdown that we didn't succeed for the community.
Sure.
This guy and his circle of other criminals, he got away with, to our knowledge, 29 or 30 major armed robbers.
A lot of money.
A lot of money.
A lot of loss.
A lot of loss. And not only loss, the ripple effect, emotional ripple effect.
I was just going to say that.
Being on the other side of that door when a round comes through the door and almost kills you, or having some guy in a ski mask force you to take your wallet out and pictures of your children and show them to him and said, I will come and get you and hurt you and your kids if you tell anybody who I am, or I was even here.
Yeah.
And so, this guy was a bad guy.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that a lot of people either just don't realize or don't understand is that, when you're victimized like that, some of these people are traumatized for their whole life.
Exactly.
They had a cannon stuck in their face. They had their family threatened, just like you described. And some of these folks, it affects them forever. I mean, we've heard cases of people having problems with alcohol and drugs, whereas they didn't before.
Sure.
And this kind of stuff has that kind of a huge effect on it. So, when we talk about the steps and the motions and the resources that we involve to deal with a case like this, on the surface, sometimes it may seem like it's a little bit of overkill. But when you really look into it and you really understand the ramifications and the fallout from this stuff, it's warranted. This guy definitely was warranted.
Everything we did
right.
to try to get him was justified and warranted.
So before we wrap it up, what would you have done any differently if you would have done anything differently?
I would have been maybe more diligent inside the house, putting a pillow back in the same place. I don't know. I still question.
Yeah, but you still don't even know if that was anything. I still don't know if
that was
and then they weren't even talking for all that time.
I probably, now there's some technology that wasn't available to us back then that I would have used inside the residence to maybe search for his tools of the trade. He always had a backpack, a fanny pack, where he had his stuff, and then sprinkle a little tracking devices, in those in those items. So he would leave a crumb trail, a footprint of being in fajitas or the restaurants.
But the bottom line is you didn't have that stuff available.
I didn't. And so there are things now, using technology and items now, that I would have applied back then. I don't know if I would have or could have done much different than we did looking back. Wish we would have caught him, but I didn't let him ruin my life. There's plenty of other crimes that come presented to you after.
That you did catch.
That we did catch.
You did a great job on.
Yeah. And I still feel I have to take my hat off to every officer that participated in that. And there were hundreds across the valley that participated in that case for doing everything they did as hard as they did and as committed to the cause. Because if there was one thing that bound us all together is that everybody knew what a danger this guy and this team was to the community. So everybody gave it 100%. So that I always appreciated.
Yeah. I look back because that was the first major investigation I was involved in SIB, and again, I had a lot of years in there just like you did. Having started on as kind of the low guy, you're doing a surveillance post in the investigation. And then in later years, as I became a supervisor for cases like that, it's one of the ones that I would look back on and think, gosh, what could we have done different or with this or that? And, I never had like anything that was glaring that I went, if I was running that show, here's what I would have done.
That's good to hear, because I've had that conversation with some Phoenix sergeant that was involved as well. I still have lunch and breakfast with him.
Oh, yeah.
Not during COVID.
Right.
But we've had the same conversation. And he's pretty convinced that the problem came from his department, that unwittingly that somebody might have just shared more than they should have with him.
I kind of agree, and I think that Bob connected some dots the best possible way he ever could have with that limited information. I think that's really what thwarted it. I never thought that there was someone who intentionally undermined the investigation. At least that's my hope, because it would just be crushing if that was what happened.
I would be crushed.
Yeah, and I agree. You know, I do look back again, because I've been that boss on those surveillances where something's going to happen, but then, you know, all your guys, let's do it, let's stay, let's do it, let's stay. And you as the boss have to make that decision. Okay, I got guys that are working on 12 hours. I got a lot of money going out on this investigation. I got to crunch the numbers, and I got to make the decision. Do I keep these guys out here for another 5 hours, or do I not? You know, I look back on that one, and I probably would have done the same thing. I think I would have done the same thing. I will say, my guys will tell you, I was always a pretty aggressive guy with, you know, time and effort and trying to make that last push and stab to achieve our goal and our objective. But I have to admit, I think I probably would have called it at Fajitas.
I think being a supervisor like you were, and the man that made the decision at Fajitas to call it was the right decision from a management point of view.
Yeah.
From a case agent grunt, sweated for 6 hours in the back of his car point of view, I was ready to sweat another 3 hours.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I disagreed, but life goes on. It was crunching the numbers and looking at things with your management goggles on. I understood.
Yeah. Interesting. That's really
But
interesting.
it doesn't make it any more palatable for him to this day.
Oh, never. Oh, no, because we've talked about that as well. Oh, yeah. Ray. And it's Ray. It's Ray. You know, it's a good friend of ours.
It was frustrating, and I'm sure he dwells on it.
Of course he does. And of course, I'm sure he second guesses it as well, as we all do with a lot of decisions that we've made that, you know, didn't go the way you wanted them to. But anyway, well, I think we've covered this one pretty well. Pretty interesting story. You got anything else? Any other thoughts or comments?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
I think so. Really interesting case. It's probably one of the very, very few that you'll ever hear on my podcast that really was that blah of an ending, unfortunately.
Sorry. I can't deliver a different ending.
But that's cops. That's cop work. That's police work.
Exactly.
So with that, guys, I'm going to close this episode of I Barely Got Here. I want to thank you for listening. Jay and I both want to thank you. And if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review. And you can ask your friends to give it a listen as well. If you have a question or a comment, you can shoot me an email anytime at ibarelygothehere@gmail.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And with that, Sam42
and King 410.
We're going to be 10-7. Thanks for listening.